The divide between President Trump and health experts over schools remains a central tension in Washington, with the president pressuring governors. This week, he warned that he might cut off federal funds if classrooms remain shuttered, and he urged the CDC to soften its recommendations. This all comes as cases soar, and states are implementing orders on face coverings, with some health officials even urging new stay-at-home orders. And it comes as an ABC News Ipsos poll out Friday shows 2/3 of Americans disapprove of the president's handling of the pandemic. Listen to the different messages this week from the president and Dr. Anthony Fauci.
It's time to be open. It's time to stay open, and we will put out the fires as they come up, but we have to open our schools. We're not closing. We'll never close. You'll have certain areas that will have difficulty, and they'll do what they have to do, and that'll be up largely to the governors.
Then there are some times when, despite the guidelines and the recommendations to open up carefully and prudently, some states skipped over those and just opened up too quickly. Certainly Florida, I know, I think jumped over a couple of checkpoints.
Joining me tonight, Yamiche Alcindor, White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. Paula, Reid, White House correspondent for CBS News. Cleve R. Wootson Jr., national political reporter for The Washington Post. And Eamon Javers, Washington correspondent for CNBC. A lot of news tonight, but let's start with the schools. Earlier today, I spoke with New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, a Democrat. He told me that he's still planning to have in-person learning this fall, but knows many challenges are ahead. He also told me his state needs $20 billion in direct federal aid to shore up its budget. Paula, open up your notebook. What is the inside scoop on the president's pressure campaign?
Well, up until now, the administration has really deferred to local leaders to determine when they want to reopen their communities based on the situation on the ground. But then you saw this week, when it comes to schools, the president issuing this broad mandate that all schools must open in the fall, or else potentially he will cut funding, when in fact we know most schools are locally funded. And he's also made other threats. He's made it clear that he is putting pressure on governors. And the question is, why is he taking this approach to schools specifically when he's deferred to states on so many other aspects of this pandemic? And in speaking with White House advisors, I'm told the president knows that in order to get parents back to work, you need to get kids back to class. And for the president, a lot of this is about hoping that that would give an economic boost to the U.S. ahead of his re-election in November. But one of the most significant things out of the administration this week is the fact that Dr. Birx, she said that we really don't have that much data on COVID in children because the under 10 set is really the least tested.
That's exactly right. You've been pressing the administration on that question all week. Yamiche, you've been talking to education leaders across the country, head of the National Education Association. What are you learning about what they need to see in these schools to make coming back feasible?
What they need to see is really a sustained evidence that there is virus that is going down and that cases are going down. So a lot of these educators, they want to make sure that they're not putting teachers in dangerous positions or students in dangerous positions. So the president has said, well, this is a virus that seems pretty safe for children, but there's a catch to that, and that is that they could infect their teachers. The other thing to note is that every situation, every city is kind of experiencing this pandemic in different ways. And one of the key things that the CDC guideline says right now is that they should have social distancing at schools. Well, when you look at a lot of schools, there are classrooms that have 30, 40 students often crammed in a classroom trying to, with one teacher trying to kind of get through the day. There's really no situation, including in New York, where you heard from the mayor, Bill de Blasio, there, that they could have all of those students in these buildings and still social distance. So that's why you saw the president this week criticizing the CDC, saying he thinks that their guidelines are too tough, too expensive, impractical. There was, of course, that statement from Vice President Pence that the CDC was going to be changing their guidelines because directly of the president's criticisms. But then the CDC said today, actually, that's not true. We're not going to be issuing any new guidelines. We're just going to be giving out more documents on the existing guidelines. So there's a real pressure campaign by President Trump to get these schools back open. But educators and local leaders are saying, unless we can do this safely, we're not going to do it.
Cleve, I'm so glad you're on the program because you've been reporting for weeks, months for the Washington Post in Florida. And Florida is seeing a spike in cases. How is that surge in cases affecting the politics in that key state?
Yeah, we're looking at a situation where 1 out of every 100 Floridians has coronavirus, right? And people are petrified. They're worried. They're afraid. But I think they're also beginning to look at, what is the reason for this? What is the cause of it? Why are 1 in every 4 coronavirus cases, in Florida? And whether there's a political reason, whether it's the governor who should do something differently.
And is the governor, what's the governor's, Governor Ron DeSantis, what's his political outlook at this moment? He's so close to President Trump.
Yeah, back in April, Ron DeSantis had a news conference in the Oval Office with President Trump, where Trump said that DeSantis is doing exactly what he wanted governors to do. He's an example of good management. And then he sort of left that news conference, and, for the next couple of months, things have just gotten worse and worse and worse, And so it's hard to see, the question will be whether or not that has political ramifications and whether that has an impact not just on DeSantis, but also on Trump.
And Eamon, it's also going to be a question of whether it's Ron DeSantis in Florida, the governor there, or Governor Murphy in New Jersey, whether they can get Congress to give them the direct aid they need. What's your latest reporting on the stimulus negotiations in Washington? What should those governors and many Americans expect, if anything?
Well, look, it seems clear that Washington is prepared to rush out some more stimulus to the states, up to, you've got Nancy Pelosi talking about $2 trillion, $1 trillion in aid to the states, because all of this is going to be super expensive, right? You're talking about these new guidelines for the schools that they have to have social distancing, they have to have cleaning, they have to have disinfectant, they have to have plastic barriers. Somebody's got to pay for all of that, Bob. And the problem is that we're sort of in a vicious cycle economically, which is that as the states have closed down, the economies have shut down. They've stopped producing revenue for the state governments in the form of taxes. The state governments need those taxes in order to pay for all the enhancements to open up the schools. And you can't, if you don't open up the schools, you don't have an economy and you don't generate taxes. So the problem is the states might not have the money they need to reopen the schools and reopen their economies. That's where the federal government can help, because the federal government, unlike the states, can simply borrow all that money and do it on deficit spending. A lot of deficit hawks in Washington, very quiet these days because there's a lot of borrowing going on here in D.C., Bob.
Paula, you are one of the reporters who talks to Dr. Fauci. You have a reporting relationship. You have depth on this beat, on the healthcare beat. He's not doing much TV. Is the White House holding him back? And are there tensions there inside the West Wing with someone who hasn't even briefed the president since June, according to his interview with the Financial Times?
There is tension, and there has been tension, because Dr. Fauci is one of the few officials who is willing to come out and publicly contradict the president. And that has happened throughout this pandemic response. And there were concerns about whether the president, who can't technically directly fire him from the federal government, would potentially push him off the task force or diminish his role. And that is what we're seeing right now. In fact, he has noted you don't see him that much on TV. And we knew earlier this week there was a press briefing at the Department of Education with the task force, and he was instructed not to go to the Department of Education, but to come here to the White House. And he told me he was sitting in the Situation Room, or about to sit in the Situation Room, because that's where he was told to go, to sort of join remotely. And that's significant because that made it impossible for him to be there to answer questions from reporters at that briefing. He could only join the meeting. Now, today there was another task force meeting here at the White House. I am told he did participate in that, but it does appear that there is an effort to diminish his role. And I asked the White House earlier this week if they were retaliating against him for contradicting the president. They said no. They said, in fact, he had been on TV about 6 times in as many weeks. Now, that does not appear to be a very common occurrence. It does appear that his role has been diminished. At the same time, he's contradicting the president.